Is that a better volume? It was a little too loud, I thought. Okay. Right, so we've seen the background political arguments and political theories and philosophies, right? And we've seen some of the interests that were at stake and some of the subjects that were the matters of fights. And we've seen the early attempts, early, before the U.S. Constitution. Articles of Association, which, as near as I can tell, everyone else in the world has completely forgotten about, which I always find extraordinary. The Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation. Then for a period of years, the United States is governed nationally under the Articles of Confederation. And in 1787, I mean, you all know this story, by 1787, this has come to be considered intolerable. It's just not working. We need something different. Right? It's a basic story, and it's not wrong. All right. What was wrong with it? And here we turn to James Madison. Now, there's a really complicated relationship between teaching or studying the American Constitution and Madison. Because on the one hand, he is held up as the father of the Constitution, the single most important of the Federalists, who were, after all, the group that secured passage of the Constitution. So the most important guy on the team that won, if you can put it that way. On the other hand, the fact is Madison lost as many arguments as he won. The Constitution, so Madison proposes the Virginia Plan, although actually as Edmund Randolph submitted, which I'll get back to in a second. It's interesting. Madison writes the Virginia Plan, which is his model of how things should work. And if you compare, as we're about to, the Virginia Plan with the actual U.S. Constitution, well, we're just going to look at the Virginia Plan, they're radically different. So, does Madison deserve this title, father of the Constitution? Whatever. He's also one of the key authors of the Federalist Papers, which we take to be very important, and we're going to look at them later when we get to the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debates. Right? He's a major player, but it's always interesting and tricky to know how much attention to devote to him. I think we need to devote a little attention to Madison just because he is so often cited in modern constitutional debates. The Federalist Society symbol is a bust of Madison. The U.S. Supreme Court has cited Madison more than 100 times in the last 5 years on an extraordinary array of topics. Madison is cited all the time, so regardless of what the historically accurate assessment of his importance might be, there's no question that Madison is a crucially important figure for the way we today look back at that history and try to recover it. All right, so Madison has spent these years living in Virginia, and he's been doing two things. One, he's been ordering books from France. Jefferson sends it's like 240, I think, books finally from France to Virginia. And Madison is madly reading mostly political philosophy. Everything that's been written on republics. About Rome, about Greece, he's reading Hume and Locke and Hobbes and Scottish common sense philosophy, which he also studied at Princeton under the guidance of Witherspoon. And he's educating himself. He's already educated, but he's sort of giving himself a PhD in constitutional theory. So he had to give it a name. It's a tremendous reading list. He's also watching Virginia politics, and he is absolutely disgusted by Virginia politics, particularly by two things. Two forms what he views as oppression. One, the established Anglican Church is oppressing non-Anglicans. And they do it all kinds of ways. They ban services. They require everyone to join the militia or pay a fine, then go around to the Quakers and collect the fines as a money-raising revenue. There was an incident where 2 ministers were thrown in jail for teaching what was viewed to be unorthodox Christian doctrine. And Madison, this is the period in which Madison develops his life. I mean, Madison's views are tricky in part because on a lot of questions they change over time. The Madison of 1787 had a very different view of federalism than the Madison of 1798, for example. But one issue on which he was completely consistent was the essential importance of freedom of worship. You got free exercise, where exercise was understood. The ability to gather and worship in the way you see fit was a core of any version of liberty in his view, and he got that from watching Virginia, where he saw the opposite taking place. The other thing he saw taking place was his arch nemesis, Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was the most powerful politician in Virginia. He actually engineered a gerrymander to try and keep Madison out of Congress in order to prevent the Constitution from being ratified. So Madison would not have been able to lead the struggle in Virginia. Henry was resolutely against the Constitution because he was resolutely a defender of local elites. So you all know that Virginia eventually splits into Virginia and West Virginia, right? Civil War. Obviously, that's 100 years away, but it's already the case that the state's very divided. The eastern part of the state is plantation, lots of slave owning, very wealthy. The western part is kind of more, it's going to become industrial. That hasn't really happened yet. It's kind of hardscrabble and poor and underpopulated, and primarily not slave owning. By the time you get to like 1840 and 1850, the Easterners are warning that the Westerners will join in a war that is coming when the North tries to free all the slaves. The Southerners are talking about that as early as 1820. The Virginia Constitutional Convention of 1820 is full of worries about a coming conflict over slavery. And they have another one in 1850. And in 1850, you have Eastern Virginian conservatives predicting conflict is imminent. So it's not as though any of this was news. But Madison observed that Patrick Henry and the other wealthy planters completely dominated state politics. And out of these two observations, he developed, this part is debatable. I mean, I'm going to suggest to you that as a matter of his personal intellectual development, each of these observations leads to one of the cores of his constitutional theory. So out of his observations about religious repression, he forms the conclusion that if you had lots of religions, no one would dominate. His theory of factions, most famously discussed in Federalist 10, starts out as a theory about religious factions. This is also the source of his insistence that religion and politics must be sharply separated. He writes the famous Memorial and Remonstrance, which he says to tax someone even 1 penny to pay for the teaching of a creed in which he does not believe is tyrannical. So it's this very, very powerful, strong church-state separatist position. One other thing about Madison, as long as we're going down this particular route, in Madison and religious liberty, on the question of religious exemptions. Do you all know what I mean by religious exemptions? Should people be exempt from following certain laws because it contradicts their faith? Madison said yes in the case of militia service, although that didn't make it into the U.S. Constitution. He said no in the case of a variety of other things, and for a wide range of issues, he said, well, it's a close call, and this will have to be worked out later. So you don't get a really clear signal. He definitely was strongly opposed to any public funding being used for any religious purpose, or, and this is the debate, going to a religious institution. And the question of the distinction between purposes and institutions, for those of you who've studied the First Amendment, you realize this is a key problem in the Establishment Clause. He definitely did not favor widespread or universal religious exemptions, although he definitely did favor them in the specific context of militia service because of the game of finding the Quakers that the Anglicans had used to raise revenue in the years in Virginia. By the time you get to 1787, Madison has decided that the states are a disaster. They simply cannot be trusted. So I'm sorry, I didn't finish. So the first theory, right, faction. And he gets that by watching the religion situation and considering that if there are lots of religions and no one predominated, that would prevent that kind of tyranny. What he learns from watching Patrick Henry and the planters is capture. The danger that an interest group will capture control of the government. An elite, the wealthy, the powerful, the slave, whoever it is in whatever particular place you are. And he observes that in states, this happens much more easily than nationally. So the other part of Federalist 10 is Madison's famous argument in favor of a large republic. Remember, classical nostalgic republicanism was all about small, homogeneous states. Madison's new science of politics is to say you have that exactly backwards. Because in small states, it's very easy for one group to capture the government and use it for its purposes. In large pluralistic states, that's much harder. And so his argument is that states are prone to oppression, they are prone to capture, and they cannot be trusted, and that's why we need a new national government. And he expresses all this in a document called Vices of the Political System of the United States, which is one of your assigned readings. All right, so what are the particular complaints that he makes about the states? First, the failure of the states to comply with constitutional requisitions. In other words, remember how the taxing system works? The federal government says to each state, you got to pay this much to pay for the war debts or whatever, and future debts. States weren't paying. States were not collecting those taxes, and they were not turning the money over to the federal government. So that is not working. Second, encroachments on the federal authority. States are not respecting the bounds between, this is on the Articles of Confederation, in which, after all, federal authority is quite limited. But even that limited authority is being disregarded, says Madison, by states eager to seize power that has been granted to the national government. Among the examples are wars and treaties that Georgia makes with the Indians, right? The power of making war and making treaties, according to the Articles of Confederation, is a national power. There's a war if 9 states say so. And if 9 states say so, all 13 are at war. That's how the Articles of Confederation set up the war-making power. But Georgia is going on and having sort of, private is the wrong word, state-level wars of its own, utterly ignoring the idea that the question of when to go to war, according to the Articles, should be national. Violation of the law of nations and of treaties. Not a year has passed. By the way, in the notes, these are numbered. The paragraphs are numbered in the document. That's why I'm not saying page 6, paragraph 2. It's just number 3. And if you go to the document, it's number 3. So it's easy, right? People are looking confused. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? Little lecture notes, they're numbered, same numbering as the document. Number 3, violations of the law of nature and treaties. Not a year has passed, he writes, without instances of them in some or other states. The Treaty of Peace, the Treaty with France, the Treaty with Holland have each been violated. I'll give you one example, because it's going to come up later in a case that we're going to look at. In Virginia, the state legislature, so the Treaty of Paris that ends the American Revolution, among many other things, provides that American courts will enforce claims by British creditors against American debtors. We won't let our Americans be dragged into English courts, but if you submit so-and-so owes me money for a shipment of whatever, right? Our courts will enforce those claims. And this is consistent with international law at the time, in which maintaining commercial transactions, the integrity of commercial transactions, is a key goal. But states are ignoring this. Virginia says, no, instead what we're going to do is any English creditor who has a claim can come to us. We, the state government, will decide whether to honor it or not. And largely we're going to say, no, we're not going to honor it. So Virginia, goes the argument, is violating the treaty. And for Madison, this is a problem. Because you can't make treaties if you can't guarantee to the other side that your people will follow it. You can't say in a treaty, okay, the war is over, we're at peace, and then have Georgia go and declare war. I mean, you can, but no one's ever going to trust your treaties ever again, right? The whole credibility thing that you hear about sometimes, it's not a new issue. Trespasses of the states and the rights of each other. I mentioned last time there was very considerable fear that there would be wars between different states. This is a very significant concern. See the law of Virginia restricting foreign vessels to certain ports, or the law of Maryland in favor of vessels belonging to their own citizens. So only Maryland ships could land at their docks, things like this. Paper money, installment of debts, occlusion of courts, making property legal tender may likewise be deemed aggressions against the rights of other states. It would take too long to explore each of those, but all the states were engaged in various forms of protectionist legislation to ensure that in commercial dealings within their state, their citizens would be in a better, more protected positions than citizens of other states. Want of concert, number 5, want of concert in matters where common interest requirements. This defect is strongly illustrated in the state of our commercial affairs. Notice Madison is very focused on economic issues. For Madison, these are crucial. And for the Federalists in general, these are crucial. The rights, it is so artificial that we divide our classes as one class on government powers and one class on rights. They're not separate questions. The rights that Madison cared about most deeply at this time, in addition to freedom of conscience, were property rights. And he was concerned that the mob, or some faction that has captured a state, might infringe on those rights. And Shays' Rebellion, the experience of Shays' Rebellion, played into that to some extent. And sure enough, he finds that there's a lack of cooperation among the states in maintaining an economy, which in turn devalues property rights. In other words, number 5 is interesting. What's the problem he's pointing to? The lack of effective national governance. Remember, the Constitution, this semester, in this course in particular, we're studying the constitutional powers. The provisions of the Constitution that create and define the powers of a national government. So the question is, why was there a perception of a need for a more empowered national government? And one answer was the states weren't paying their debts. Another one is we're not able to govern with respect to national issues in an effective way. Number 6, want of guarantee to the states of their constitutional laws against internal violence. So this is a version of his capture fear, But he says, look, if there were a minority that controlled all the power, controlled all the money, or controlled the militia, they could capture the state. They could rule and oppress the majority in that state. Much harder to do that, as he's going to argue in Federalist 10, at the scale of the United States. Very easy to do that at the scale of some of the individual states. The Confederation is silent on this point, and thereby the second article, the hands of the federal authority are tied. That is, there's nothing that says the federal government can intervene. There's nothing that says the federal government has the authority to intervene in a state if the state loses its democratic form of government. In the US Constitution, this becomes the Republican Guarantee Clause. Those of you who are familiar with that clause. But here Mattis is saying one thing that's wrong with the articles is if a state turns tyrannical, the federal government has no power to do anything about it. Number 7, want of sanction to the laws and coercion in the government of the Confederacy. A sanction is essential to the idea of law, as coercion is to that of government. The federal system being destitute of both wants that is lacks the great vital principles of a political constitution. It's meaningless to say you have law if there's no enforcement mechanism. It's meaningless to say you have government if it has no powers of coercion. And what we have is a federal government that can't do either. Under the Articles of Confederation, says Madison, the federal government has to ask the states to carry out all of its actions and its mandates and its policies. This is impossible. This is why none of the federal mandates and policies are actually being carried out. Number 8, this one's interesting. Want of ratification by the people of the Articles of Confederation. All right, this is a really interesting point. So let's take a moment on this one. We are going to see a big debate, which goes on to this day. It's part of that whole compact theory debate. It's a political theory question, but I mean, it's hotly debated to this day. Here's the question. Was the US Constitution adopted by the states, the 13 different peoples of the 13 different states, or a single people of the United States? The preamble says, we the people of the United States. And on one side of the argument, you say, see, I mean, that's one thing people point to. So that must mean it's the national people. The people who are more inclined toward the compact theory, toward state sovereignty and states' rights, say, no, it was states. These were free, independent states. Declaration of Independence, right? At the end of the Declaration of Independence, what do we have? Autonomous, independent states possessed of all the powers of the nations of the earth, including war and peace. Right? But as Madison points out, even the Articles of Confederation took away some of those. So it's a complicated, messy question. Here, Madison is raising it, and he's raising it not so much to criticize the Articles of Confederation as to raise a question that he realizes is going to be crucial in the attempt to secure adoption of the new Constitution. So listen to what he writes. In some of the states, the Confederation is recognized by and forms part of the Constitution. In others, however, it has received no other sanction than that of the legislative authority. That is, in some states, the state constitutions have been changed to refer to the Articles of Confederation. In others, states are depending on ordinary legislation, laws passed by governments, which is how treaties work. Right? If these are sovereign nations entering into a treaty, how does the US do a treaty, right? It's ratified by the Senate. It's an act of legislation. So in some states, says Madison, the adoption of the Articles of Confederation is being treated like it's a treaty among sovereign governments. In other states, it's being written into the state constitution to make it more organic. Why is that a problem? As far as the union of the states is to be regarded as a league of sovereign powers and not as a political constitution by virtue of which they are become one sovereign power, so far it seems to follow from the doctrine of compacts that a breach of any of the articles by any of the parties absolves the other parties from respective obligations and gives them the right, if they choose to exert it, of dissolving the union altogether. The Articles of Confederation, says Madison, are based on the compact model of sovereign states entering into a treaty. But if that's true, then there's a right of secession. And if there's a right of secession, there's a right of dissolution of the union altogether. So Madison views the compact theory and the idea of sovereign states as one of the vices that needs to be cured with the adoption of a new constitution. Number 9, the multiplicity of laws in several states. This is Madison, the in-the-weeds political scientist, just critiquing the legislative habits of state legislators. Number 10, the mutability of the laws of the states, same thing. Right? One of the ways you can't trust the states is that their legislatures, because they can be captured by interests, aren't devoted to the rule of law. They'll change the rules from year to year to suit the parties, the elites, or the empowered parties that they represent. The fear of capture goes with the fear of a breakdown of rule of law. And at this point, Madison has reached the point where he's decided states cannot be trusted with these fundamental issues. Number 11, injustice of the laws of the states. He goes, if you read the paragraph, he has a few words to say, but basically, look around you. States are doing evil things. Why, Madison asks, why are the states so terrible? What went wrong? Well, for one thing, he says they keep electing the wrong people. Right, back to the representation question. This is under section B, number 1. Representative appointments are sought from 3 motives: ambition, personal interest, or public good. Unhappily, the first 2 are proved by experience to be most prevalent. Right, the people becoming politicians are not the most virtuous Republican citizens who are most devoted to public good. They're people who are ambitious and want to be important. Or they're people who seek gain and think they become wealthy by holding political positions, which is not entirely crazy. I mean, I'll say it. George Washington died owning 52,000 acres of land. In the course of his lifetime, he owned more than 65,000. Almost all of them worked by slaves. It's not entirely insane in this period of history to be concerned, about immensely people seeking office for purposes of ambition or wealth, even though we think of Washington as the purest of the pure, don't we? He worked hard to develop that impression. How easily are base and selfish measures masked by pretexts of public good and apparent expediency. So one problem is, at the state level, they're electing unvirtuous people to high office. A second problem is that states are, I've talked about this, but here's his discussion, are prone to capture, particularly by a majority. So this is the beginning of Madison's fear of the tyranny of the majority. A still more fatal, if not frequent clause, lies among the people themselves. All right, why? What's the deal? What is wrong with the people in these various states such that they are prone to capture by tyrannical majorities? Well, first of all, they have a general tendency to form factions. All civilized societies are divided into different interests and factions, as they happen to be creditors or debtors. You've noticed I've been emphasizing that a little bit. Rich or poor, husbandmen, merchants or manufacturers, members of different religious sects, followers of different political leaders, inhabitants of different districts, owners of different kinds of property, etc., etc. Right? There are, no matter what you do, this whole the idea of a homogeneous, unified, organic city-state is nonsense. In real life, people have different interests. Different economic interests, different religious identities, different forms of members of different religious sects, followers of different political factions, and so on. So in real life, division of the faction is inevitable. The result is capture. In Republican government, the majority, however composed, gives the law. It is an old school pre-American republicanism. Right? What is the liberty of the ancients? That we rule ourselves. It's not about the freedom of individuals. It's that collectively we are ruled by ourselves, not outsiders. So in that principle, in that system, the majority discerns what the law is. Whenever, therefore, an apparent interest or common passion unites a majority, what is to restrain them from unjust violations of the interests and rights of the minority or of individuals? Case in point, the majority of Virginia were Anglican. Therefore, Anglican Church was the established state church. Madison chose Princeton over William and Mary because he wanted to keep away from the Anglican establishment of William and Mary, where he would have been required to study religious topics, specifically Anglican teaching of religious topics. Right? Classic example, a majority religion takes over and establishes its religion. This is the danger, says Madison, of states, because people are prone to faction. People want things, so they will use their factions to oppress others. Well, how can you fix this? He says there are 3 possible checks, and none will be effective so long as states operate as independent sovereign entities. So long as we have this idea of the compact theory and sovereign states governing themselves, we will never solve these problems. Why not? Well, number 1, you could appeal to enlightened self-interest. A prudent regard to their good is involved in the general and permanent good of the community. Right? You all know the idea of enlightened self-interest, right? I don't need to explain that. Yeah? Anybody not know what I'm talking about? Cool. This consideration, although of decisive weight in itself, is found by experience to be far too often unheeded. Notice the consistent references to experience. Madison has been watching Virginia over the past 8 years, and he's come to doubt some of the teachings of political theory in these books he's been reading from Jefferson. He's come to think that the reality is messier, more political, if I can use a word, needs more mechanical, institutional design features to secure it. It doesn't work, he's come to think, to depend on virtue or unity or a shared identity. Doesn't work meaning doesn't work to secure essential liberties against tyrannical rule. And of course, in this, Madison is talking about the liberty of the moderns. Right? These are states governed according to the liberty of the ancients. As long as we rule ourselves, that is liberty. Think of the South Carolinian phrase, the peculiar institution. This is our way. A reference to slavery. How can you, surely you've stumbled across this at some point, like in high school. How is it possible that people who are protecting the right to own human beings as slaves claim to do so in the name of liberty? The answer is they didn't mean liberty of individuals. Liberty meant we rule ourselves in our way, and outsiders don't tell us what to do, and the slaves weren't part of the we. It's very Athenian. Like I mentioned, the estimate is that in Athens, 24% of the population or so were citizens. Everybody else was a slave or a foreigner or a visitor, and none of them had all these political rights. Madison is saying, well, yeah, but what about the liberty of the moderns? What about individual freedoms and rights? Freedom of conscience, freedom of religious exercise, economic liberties, and the protection of property rights. These modern liberal ideas, they are not protected. And relying on enlightened self-interest isn't going to work. Nor is it relying on moral character. Secondly, respect for character, however strong this motive may be in individuals, is considered as very insufficient to restrain them from injustice. No one wants to be thought a crook. You know what? If you get rich or powerful on it, you can live with that. Shaming people has not an effect, thinking poorly of the wealthy and the powerful historically has not had the effect of causing them to make their behavior more virtuous in the way that you would like. What about religion? In Virginia, there's an established Anglican church. Okay, could the Anglican church, through its teachings, preserve liberty? Could religion be a force for liberty and freedom? It is not pretended to be such on men individually considered. No one thinks that religious believers are never ambitious or dishonest. I mean, being a member of a church has nothing to do, with being politically virtuous. Even being religiously moral is not the same thing as being politically virtuous. No one thinks that Anglicans are more likely to set the public good among their private interest than Presbyterians. So Madison says, look, there are three possible answers to sort of the virtue argument. Enlightened self-interest, so rational virtue, reason will lead people to do the right thing. Moral character, we have just citizens are born with virtue, perhaps it's inculcated through education or religious teaching. None of those, says Madison, will do, or will solve these problems. You can't rely on any of them. So what we need is a new form of government. You can't rescue the current system. As long as the states are sovereign, independent entities, they are bound by a treaty, they are prone to capture, they are prone to corruption, and things will continue to go south. So, we need to change the idea of sovereignty. Section C, number 1. The great desideratum in government is such a modification of the sovereignty as will render it sufficiently neutral between the different interests and factions. You need a version of sovereignty that cannot be captured by an interest or a faction. Whether it's a religious faction or an economically interested faction or a political faction. The sovereign has to be something above partisan politics. As will render it to control one part of the society from invading the rights of another, and at the same time sufficiently controlled itself from setting up an interest adverse to that of the whole society. Right? The flip danger, the one the opponents of the Constitution are worried about, is that an overweening and excessively powerful national government will itself become the interest group that is in power. Both of these dangers, says Madison, have to be avoided, and the way to avoid them is by modifying our system of government and moving beyond the present model of sovereignty. Secondly, we need a better system of elections, one that will better ensure that the best men are elected. not the ones who are just as corrupt as everybody else in the state. An auxiliary desideratum for the amelioration of the Republican form. To ameliorate is to diminish a harm. Is such a process of elections as will most certainly extract from the mass of society the purest and noblest characters which it contains. All right, and that's it. Madison is not here offering solutions. The document is called Vices of the System of Government in the United States. He's laying out the problems. These last paragraphs are hints. How are we going to solve this? With a new constitution, a new system of government, a new way of thinking about elections. We need new systems and structures, and we have to abandon the current idea of sovereignty. That's as much as he's saying right now. So based on these complaints, Madison creates the Virginia Plan in 1787. Now, I was going to dive again into some details of Madison biography, but I'll skip it. Edmund Randolph is the one who actually presents the plan in Congress, but Madison wrote it. Randolph is, by the way, one of the most fascinating of all of these characters, and well worth looking up to sometime just to see a really interesting story. He was a Federalist who favored the Constitution, but then refused to sign it, but then argued in favor of its ratification. Yeah, you're going to want to walk through that slowly a couple of times to see how it works. So the Virginia Plan. This is Madison's proposal for what a Constitution should look like. And it starts with favoring a republic over a confederation. We have to get away from this idea of independent sovereign states bound by treaty and toward the idea of the United States as a single republic. It has already been, page 70 on the right, paragraph 2. We're now back in the textbook. It is already seen by many, and must by degrees be seen by all, that unless the Union be organized efficiently on Republican principles, that is, the whole United States as a republic, innovations of much more objectionable form may be obtruded, or in the most favorable event, the partition of the empire into rival and hostile confederacies will ensue. If we can't make the United States one republic, there will be wars. It will break apart. We'll break into 3 states, or 13 states, or 5 states, or something. And then he lists a whole bunch of specific provisions, and I don't intend to go through all of them, but a few of them are particularly interesting. For example, 70 on the right, paragraph 4, section 2. He says representation in Congress should be proportional to the number of free inhabitants. So you don't count slaves, first of all, but you do count non-citizens. And you do count children, even though they can't vote, or visiting foreigners. As you know, how we count and who we count is a modern issue. I'm just pointing out the fact that Madison had an early position on this question. Sections 3, 4, 5, and 6 are about the design of the federal government. He wants a bicameral legislature. That is, the Congress should be divided into 2 houses, what we now call the House and the Senate. The reason? Madison's fear was that the legislature would be too powerful. Madison's great fear was not the executive. He did not fear that America would have its own, that American presidents, to use the term that's going to come into play, that American presidents would become kings. He worried that the Congress would become too powerful. And so he proposed dividing it into 2 houses with different systems of elections, so that each house would act as a check on the other and thus diminish the possibility of legislative overreach. And then there are the 2 most important. Section 8. I've told you, and I believe I've showed you, that Madison has come to deeply distrust the states by this time. Here's how far that distrust goes. Madison wants all state laws to be reviewed by a national council who have the power to strike them down, not if they're unconstitutional, just if they're a bad idea. Just absolute veto power. This is called the Council of Revision. Page 71 on the left. Resolve that the executive, so the president, and a convenient number of the national judiciary, so a bunch of judges, so you have a council of the president and some judges, ought to compose a council of revision with authority to examine every act of the national legislature, that's the Congress, before it shall operate, and every act of a particular legislature, that's the states, before a negative thereon shall be final, that the dissent of said council shall amount to a rejection. Every federal and state law should be reviewed by this national council, which has authority to veto it just because they think it's a bad idea. That is the most strident possible institutional expression of distrust for states you can imagine. This goes way beyond modern judicial review. We have big fights. We have big debates. Was it part of the original understanding that courts should be able to strike down laws that are unconstitutional? Hell, Madison wanted a court that could strike down laws just because they didn't like it. Resolved, Section 11, that a Republican government of each state ought to be guaranteed by the United States to each state. That's his comment about tyranny in the states and the lack of federal response. He wants a guarantee clause that says if a state becomes unrepublican, meaning undemocratic, it's captured, it's taken over, it's tyrannical, the federal government will step in and wipe that government out. The national government ought to guarantee that each state operates on proper republican principles. So obviously, the Virginia plan is incredibly nationalistic and state-oriented. Madison wants a level of concentration of power and authority, at least in the form of a veto, far beyond anything we've ever seen in actual practice, which tells you that Madison didn't win these arguments, or at least not completely. The opposing plan was the New Jersey plan, presented by William Paterson. Paterson's goal was to preserve as much as possible of the current system of independent and quasi-sovereign or sovereign states, while nonetheless addressing some of the problems that Madison had pointed out in the vices, the failure of an effective national government, the inability to force the states to contribute taxes to the national costs, and so on. So Paterson's, among the Federalist plans, the New Jersey plan is much more oriented toward being close to the Articles of Confederation. The Virginia plan is extremely, to use Kramnick's terms, an extreme example of modernizing state power theory. So Paterson is designed, say the author is just to favor the smaller states, for fear that they might be dominated. Thus keeping equal representation of states in Congress, rather than representations by population. You'll recognize that's the Senate. Right? Why does Montana have as many senators as California, when Montana has as many people as one county in California? The ratio, the difference is a Montana senator represents about 1/80th as many people as a California senator. There's no theory of democracy in which that makes sense, or a republic. It's a hangover. It's one of the arguments Paterson wins and Madison loses. It's a hangover from the old idea of states as separate sovereign countries. Taxation and revenue positions shall still be based on the government asking for money and the states raising it. But if you look at 72 on the right, paragraph 1, you'll notice a 3/5 provision of section. Let's skip that. The taxation system will remain as it is. There will not be direct authority of the federal government to impose taxes on people. They have to go through the states. This preserving the financing structure of the Articles of Confederation. Number 3, regarding courts in section 5. If you compare section 5 of the New Jersey plan with section 9 of the Virginia plan, we didn't focus on that one, but it's where Madison talks about courts. They both want a national Supreme Court to deal with cases involving foreigners. Because remember, there's been a big problem with states not complying with the Treaty of Paris involving foreign creditors. One difference is that Madison wants a national court that will also hear all cases involving people from different states. Paterson does not. So the New Jersey plan, finally, is different from the Virginia plan in that under the New Jersey plan, the powers of the federal government are enumerated. They're specified and listed. Under Madison's Virginia plan, the federal government is simply to have power to do what is necessary. Now again, as you'll recognize, Paterson wins this argument. We have a constitution that has enumerated powers. But it's fascinating that at this time, Madison is pushing for a much more nationalistic, much more state-oriented modernizing approach. All right, those are the broad strokes of the fight, the division between the Virginia and the New Jersey plans. But there were lots of specific debates in the convention, and a few of them are worth looking at. For example, should there be a national veto power? Remember, Madison wanted a council revision that could veto any federal or state law. Alternative might be a veto by a president. Should there be any kind of national veto power in general? Charles Pinckney said yes, and it should be the Congress. that the national legislature should have authority to negative all laws which they should judge to be improper. Why the Congress? Because the Congress represents the national people. If you view the United States as a single people, and Congress as the voice of that people, then Congress is the body that should most obviously be empowered with protection of the Constitution and protection of liberty and everything else. Right? Time before? There was a day in which we talked about theories of constitutional interpretation, right? We talked about originalism and historicism and interpretivism and living constitutionalism. We talked, right? I talked about clearing the underbrush. I didn't want to dwell on that, which is true. I don't want to dwell on it, but we can come back to it occasionally. This is one of those moments. Arguments in favor of historical approaches in particular, like originalism, are usually couched in terms of a desire to constrain the discretion of judges. Why should judges be anchored to an historical understanding? So they're not imposing their own. The negative term here is activist. So-and-so is being an activist judge, a term which has multiple meanings. But one understanding of that term is departing from the historical understanding and imposing their own. Okay, great. As a theory about constraining judges, that may or may not make sense, and that's a long discussion, and that's fine. But as a theory of constraining the people, none of the theories really get to the question, should the people of the United States have the authority, not judges, the people, to determine what the Constitution means for them? And if the answer is yes, then how would they do that? And the answer would be Congress. We don't have polling in these days. We can't go ask everybody, right? So when you hear Pinckney, a Federalist of the First Order, Southern, promoting the idea that Congress should be able to strike down laws that are deemed improper, what you're hearing is a developed argument that starts with the idea that there is a single national people, that the national people, popular sovereignty, are the source of authority for the Constitution and the system of government, and therefore the people, speaking through their voice, the Congress, should be able to determine what the Constitution does and does not require. Arguably, it's even broader than that. He says proper, or improper, which is broader than unconstitutional. Back to Pinckney. He urged that such a universality of that power was indispensably necessary to render it effectual. The states must be kept in due subordination to the nation. That if the states were left to act of themselves, in any case, it would be impossible to defend the national prerogatives. This universal negative was, in fact, a cornerstone of efficient national government. And Madison agrees. Madison also supports a national veto, although, as we've seen, he supports a constitutional revision rather than Congress. He could not but regard an indefinite power to negative legislative acts of the states as absolutely necessary to a perfect system. Note that word, perfect. Experience had evinced a constant tendency in the states to encroach on the federal authority. Right, this is all from the vices. He's just reiterating his complaints. To violate national treaties, to infringe the rights and interests of each other, to oppress the weaker party within their respective jurisdiction. A negative was the mildest, that is a veto, was the mildest expedient that could be devised for preventing these mischiefs. From the Federalist side, there's very strong support. Madison and Pinckney and no Federalist is really speaking against this, in favor of a national veto of state laws, because you can't trust the states. Enter Hamilton. I've asked you this before, I'm sorry, I can't remember. How many of you have seen the musical? Right, remember I referred to that moment when he says, I'm going to the Constitutional Convention. And then they say he proposed a new form of government. Let's take a look at what that proposed new form of government was and why it didn't make it into the musical. Hamilton proposes a king. He says there should be an elected king who will serve a lifetime term. When the king dies, the people will elect a new king who will serve a lifetime term. Why? Because we need a ruler who can resist the passions of the moment. Right? Pinckney and Madison are saying the people must determine the meaning of the Constitution, what's an improper state law, and so they should speak through their voice, the Congress. Hamilton is saying, no, we need a chief executive who can resist the people. When a great object of government is pursued which seizes the popular passion, They spread like wildfire and become irresistible. He appealed to the gentlemen from New England where their experience had not there verified their remark. And he's appealing to the New England Federalists who are largely in favor of the sort of Pinckney-Madison approach. Furthermore, a king can better resist corruption from foreign influence than an elected president. The hereditary interests of the king are so interwoven with that of the nation. Sorry, this is page 87 on the left in the middle. And his personal emoluments so great that he was placed above the danger of being corrupted from abroad. He's so rich and so devoted to the nation, there's no risk of him being influenced by foreign Russian influences, for example. That was supposed to be a joke? No? Nothing? Yeah. Too soon? One of the weak sides of republics was their being liable to foreign influence and corruption. Men of little character, acquiring great power, become easily the tools of intermeddling. Hamilton says, look, there's nothing wrong with an elected king. It's still a republic. An elected king is still a republican form of government, right? It's not how we're ruled, it's that we rule ourselves. Hamilton is playing fast and loose with different concepts of liberty here. Let one branch of the legislature hold their places for life, or at least during good behavior. Let the executive also be for life, right? So you wanted a lifetime term in the Senate and an elected lifetime king. Is this a republican government? Yes, if all the magistrates are appointed and vacancies are filled by the people, or a process of election originating with the people. Right? Our Supreme Court justices aren't elected, but they're selected in the process that begins with elections. An executive for life has not this motive for forgetting his fidelity and will therefore be a safer depository of power. He goes on to argue that a 7-year presidential term, which Madison proposed, is no less monarchical than a lifetime king. Dickinson, John Dickinson of Delaware, an important character, he objected to the Declaration of Independence, but then went and fought on the American side in the Revolution, then came back and was a member of the Constitutional Convention. He agreed. He says, look, I agree, Alexander, I don't disagree in principle, but there's no way you can sell this. So the next best thing, he says, is federalism. If we can't get a king, the next best thing is federalism. A limited monarchy, he considered as one of the best governments in the world. Alexander, you're not wrong. A well-run monarchy is terrific. It was certain that equal blessings had never yet been derived from any of the republican form. He's talking about England. England, with a system of the king in parliament, he says, is far superior to any of the ancient republics. It was, a limited monarchy, however, was out of the question. The spirit of the times, the state of our affairs, forbade the experiment. Now, you're right, that's probably the best solution, but look where we are, that's not going to happen. There's actually a nice paragraph in Hamilton's speeches where he says, I know right now the people hear the word king and react negatively, but we can educate them. We, the Congress, can bring them along and persuade them that an elected king is a good idea. Dickens says, nah, that's not going to fly. What's the next best thing? 85 on the right, paragraph 1. But though a form the most perfect, perhaps in itself be unobtainable, we must not despair. If ancient republics have been found to flourish for a moment only and then to vanish, they tend to be short-lived. It only proves they were badly constituted. We ought to seek for every remedy of their diseases. One of these remedies he conceived to be the accidental, lucky division of this country into distinct states, a division which some seem desirous to abolish altogether. Historical accident. We start out as 13 different chartered colonies. The result was we're 13 different states. We've discovered federalism. This is great, says Dickinson. Sorry. This is great, says Dickinson, the one-time Tory. It's not as good as a limited monarchy, but it will do. And Madison and Pinckney, you guys who want to break down those divisions between the states, you're wrong. So it's a debate. These things were debated. There were sharply different positions, not just philosophies, sharply different positions on questions. Should there be a national veto? How about this one? Should there be a president or a council? Should the chief executive be one person or 3? There's a debate we don't have anymore because we just take it for granted, don't we? At the time, it wasn't clear at all. You should go look at a document by John Adams in 1776 called Thoughts on Government. Right, 1776, obviously way early. It's the Declaration of Independence. After the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Sons of Liberty call on each of the colonies to write their own new constitution, and Adams publishes this essay called Thoughts on Government about that process. And one of the things that was remarkable about that essay is the extent to which Adams treats the whole thing as an experiment. He said, well, we could try a confederation, and if that doesn't work, we could switch to a single national unit, or maybe we could try federalism, whatever. We could try one president or a council. He's like, we'll try things. We'll try things for a few years. If they don't work out, we'll change them. For the first 15 years, there was this assumption that everything was open to change. There's a distinct historical point at which people start treating the Constitution as kind of a sacred text or unchangeable given. Right? You can only amend it with the amendment. In the early years, the assumption was this is a first try, and we'll fix it later if it doesn't work out well, particularly if you go back to the 1776. So it's not shocking. There were strong divisions on questions that we think obvious, like should the president be one person? No, says Edmund Randolph. Randolph says, right, the guy who introduced the Virginia Plan, he didn't write it, but he introduced it. No, says Randolph, it should be 3. He should not do justice to the country which sent him, Virginia being named as a country, if he was silent to suffer the establishment of unity in the executive department. He urged the permanent temper of the people was adverse to every semblance of a monarch. Unity was unnecessary, a plurality being equally competent to all the objects of the department. Necessary confluence would never be reposed in a single magistrate. The appointments, if there were a single president, would generally be in favor of some inhabitants near the center of the country. Consequently, the remote parts would not be on an equal footing. He was in favor of 3 members of the executive drawn from different portions of the country. What if instead of 1 president we had, well, it's a bigger country now, let's say 5, each drawn from a different geographical region of the country? Pierce Butler, South Carolina, equally agreed that a single president would be a disaster. If 1 man should be appointed, he would be responsible. I'm sorry. Whoops. Sorry. Pierce Butler took the opposite position. Pierce Butler says, no, we need 1 person rather than 3 in order to preserve accountability, representation. If 1 man should be appointed, he would be responsible to the whole and would be impartial to its interests. If 3 or more should be taken for as many districts, it would be a constant struggle for local advantage. So Butler argues you need 1 president because a single person can conceive of himself as representing the whole nation. Whereas if you have people drawn from different regions, they'll represent those regions. And there'll be a conflict of interest. No, says Randolph. 1 person can't represent the whole nation. Moreover, the likely outcome, the almost certain outcome, is that this person will be drawn from the heavily populated, wealthy central part of the country. Right? So there'll be this built-in bias, and that's why we need an executive council. How about the executive veto? This is not the national veto. This is now, if we have a president, this is in the federal government, can the president veto acts of Congress? Should that be part of our new Constitution? Franklin says no. A very noted Federalist and strong supporter of the Declaration of Independence, Franklin opposes the idea of the president having a veto power. The negative of the governor, this is in the states he's talking about, was constantly made use to extort money. Right? He shares Madison's contempt for the states and their politics. No good law whatever could be passed without a private bargain with him. You want me to not veto this law? What's in it for me? Pay to play. An increase of his salary or some donation was always made a condition. He was afraid if a negative should be given as proposed, at least enough would be gotten to influence and bribe the legislature into complete subjection to the will of the executive. Roger Sherman is also against a veto, but for different reasons. Sherman believes it's contrary. The reason we're doing this is I'm hoping, if not now while I'm talking, at least you'll actually think about these questions. Is Sherman right that giving the president veto power over Congress contradicts democracy? Is Franklin right that giving the president veto power just creates a new bargaining situation, a new trading of favors in the process of lawmaking? No 1 man could be found so far above all the rest in his wisdom. He thought we ought to avail ourselves of his wisdom in revising the laws, but not permit him to overrule the legislation. But Sherman's view is no 1 person is so far above the rest that he should be allowed to have single authority. The Congress speaks for the people. As a multiple member council, that should be the source of authority for determining important questions. Madison was for it, as long as there was an override. If a proper proportion of each branch should be required to overrule the objections of the executive, it would answer the same purpose as an absolute negative. That is, he wants a veto for all the reasons he's talked about, but he's willing to allow it to be subject to override. Wilson is for it. Why? Because knowing it exists, he says, just the fact that it's possible, will prevent the legislatures from doing crazy things. The House and the Senate won't pass crazy legislation if they know it's likely to get vetoed. The legislature would know that such a power existed and would refrain from such laws as would be sure to defeat. Its silent operation would therefore preserve harmony and prevent mischief. There used to be a theory that in modern American politics the Supreme Court functions that way. States won't knowingly pass laws that the court will strike down. Actually, going back about 30 or 40 years, there's been a strategy of passing laws that the court will strike down so you can then blame the courts. The abortion law argument in Texas is a case in point. There's a lot of debate among political scientists. What would be the political consequences for the Republican leadership in Texas if that law were upheld? Have they been playing a game that legislators from both parties have played for years? But for example, on the abortion issue, classic example. For decades, states have passed strict anti-abortion laws, knowing the federal courts would strike them down. So they could then go publicly and say, you see, it's all because of these courts. There is an argument. I don't know the answer. It's an argument. There's an argument that claims if the authority went back to the states, the political parties and the political leadership would have to take responsibility for the laws they actually pass, and the political outcome might not be what they expect. It's an interesting question. But Wilson is speaking of that silent operation, the idea, he's assuming people won't game the system. Historically, we know that he's wrong. Gunning Bedford from Delaware is against it on democratic grounds. He is against every check on the legislature. The Congress is the people. John Locke said the legislature is the soul of the Commonwealth. If you believe in social contract democracy, liberal democracy, then the legislature should be the source of authority because that's where the people speak. What about impeachment? Right? None of this was established. There was none of this in the Articles of Confederation. Should Congress have the power to impeach a president? Madison says yes, he thought it was indispensable that some provision should be made for defending the community against the incapacity, negligence, or perfidy of the chief magistrate. Notice, Madison's proposal is that a president should be impeached just for doing a bad job. Madison's view of impeachment is much closer to the British vote of no confidence than the version we ended up with, high crimes and misdemeanors. And Madison is not being radical here. Many of the states varied. Many of the states provided for impeachment of governor for incompetence or just failure of adequate performance of his duties. If you're doing a bad job, you can get replaced. And that was the version that Madison happened to favor. And he talks about the concerns, financial corruption, foreign influence, loss of capacity. Charles Pinckney is against. He said he was sure they ought not to issue from the legislature, who in that case hold them as a rod over the executive. Right? So Pinckney, on the one hand, favored very nationalizing kind of forces. On the other hand, he also believes in separation of powers. If there's a power of impeachment, he's saying, the Senate, the Congress will threaten it all the time. Presidents will always be operating under the threat of being impeached. And the branches of the legislature will therefore be able to control the president. Elbridge Gerry is in favor. So you have various arguments here in the notes and in the text before and against. Randolph, again, who I insist is one of the most interesting, 88 on the left. The executive will have great opportunities of abusing his power, particularly in time of war, when military force and in some respects the public money will be in his hands. Right? During periods of war, the president has much more authority in relation to Congress than in peacetime. Should no regular punishments be provided, it will be irregularly inflicted by tumults and insurrections. If you don't have a mechanism for removing a president who's behaving badly, what will happen instead is public resistance, disruption. Ratification. So those are the models and those are the arguments. Those are some of the arguments. There's these different models on the floor. As you know, there's the committee, Edmund Randolph leads the committee of detail, whose job it is to produce the draft of the actual Constitution. It is then approved by the Congress and sent to the states for ratification. And the ratification stories are fascinating. Different states did it differently, for one thing. Philadelphia Convention used the double majoritarian approach. That is, you need a ratification by a majority of the Assembly in Pennsylvania, and then there should be, these are debates about how ratification should go. And then there should also be a majority of the states voting in favor. And that was adopted. So the rule was this has to be adopted by popular conventions held in the states, not the state legislatures, though, not the state governments. Different from the Articles of Confederation, different from a treaty. A treaty is entered into by governments. This system required separate popular conventions in each state, not run by the state government, and approval by 9 out of the 13 states. You'll remember that 9 out of 13 states' approval in the Articles of Confederation was enough to launch a war. So that 9 out of 13 number is here appearing again. It's a supermajority requirement. That which was sufficient under the Articles of Confederation to start a war is sufficient to adopt this Constitution. The presumption being that any dissenting states will be bound by the vote of the 9. Strategically, the Anti-Federalists immediately began demanding a new convention. And they used the Bill of Rights, the absence of a Bill of Rights, as one of their arguments. They said there's no Bill of Rights, therefore this is a dangerous document and inappropriate, therefore we need a new convention. The Federalists were quite convinced that if a new convention were held, there would be no Constitution. That it was lightning in a bottle, a moment that couldn't be recreated. And now the Anti-Federalists were mobilized. If they allowed a new convention, it would fail. So the Federalists were desperate not to have that happen. Be a little careful about the version of the story that says that the Anti-Federalists were promoting a Bill of Rights because they cared deeply about liberties. Anti-Federalists proposed more than 200 amendments, the vast majority of which had to do with preserving state sovereignty and prerogative. The Bill of Rights was a topic of only a few of them. It was as much PR as any genuine concern. In Massachusetts, however, the Federalists, facing significant resistance, came upon a strategy of saying, if this convention approves ratification of the Constitution, we promise to bring a Bill of Rights as a set of amendments immediately upon ratification. That passed in Massachusetts, and that became the Federalist strategy. So as a matter of political strategy, if you review, for example, the correspondence between Madison and Jefferson, right, is a Bill of Rights necessary? No. It might be harmful, but it might be useful. Well, it doesn't matter, Madison finally says. We need one to get this thing adopted. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, we can go through the arguments perhaps when we get to later about why it might be a bad thing when we get to the text of the Constitution. Short answer, if you list the rights, you imply the others don't exist. If you list rights that limit federal powers that aren't granted, you imply the federal government has those powers. There are various arguments as to why it might be a bad idea to have a Bill of Rights. We'll come back to them if you like. But it's a matter of political necessity. And so after the Massachusetts Convention and all the other conventions, the Federalists say, okay, if this is passed and adopted, we promise to immediately bring up a Bill of Rights. And of course, that's what happened. So there's the version that was adopted in 1887, and then the additional Bill of Rights in 1891. Now, it's really interesting to notice the way American historians over time have told different stories about how the Constitution came to be. In the 40s, Louis Hartz, an American historian and political historian, presented what is still a popular argument in some quarters, that Americans were nothing but Lockean liberalism. It was straight Lockean liberalism all down the line that explains everything. It was the single monocausal dominant political theory of early America. Obviously, since I assigned you Kramnik's article, I don't buy it. I think Kramnik is much more correct. There were multiple theories at work, and you can pretty easily find it. But there was a period when this was the dominant teaching. If you went in the equivalent of a high school AP course in those days, you would have been told it was all Lockean liberalism and economic prerogative. You get to the 60s. Actually, I'm sorry, my dates are off because Beard is in the 30s. You get to the 30s and 40s, Charles Beard is a progressive writer. And he argues in kind of Marxist terms, no, this is all about economic interest. The members of the convention who supported the Constitution did so because it supported their personal economic interests. And the whole thing was about preserving wealth against the threats of redistribution. His evidence for this was the things like the strong support for property rights and the Shays Rebellion experience and how that had shaped concerns about protecting banks and Madison's fear of the mob. The problem is, further historical research showed it just wasn't true. That is, as a matter of individual biography, it was not true that all the members, or even the vast majority of the members of the convention, were personally profiting from the provisions they were adopted. Just as historical research showed that Hartz's story wasn't true. It wasn't true that all the writing at the time, or even the vast majority of it, was straightforward Lockean liberalism. There was much more going on. So you get to the 1960s and 70s, and you have people like Gordon Wood and Bernard Bailyn. I don't know if you know these names. If you may have run across them in high school or in a college course. These are very prominent American historians of the next intellectual generation. Their argument is, no, it wasn't about Lockean liberalism at all. It was all about republicanism. You have to understand, right, again, not the Kramnik multiple thing. No, there was one single dominant theory, and it was a Scottish common sense realism plus classical republicanism. In the modern era, you tend to get, at least in serious writing, academic writing, scholars, much more of the Kramnik view. There were multiple political philosophies at work. They were in conflict. The design of the Constitution was a compromise among interests and ideas and political actors, right? It's all just very complicated and messy. But it's interesting how each generation of historians comes up with a version of the story of how the Constitution happened that suits some set of purposes or some narrative or some grander understanding. I mention all this just to point out that the story I've been telling you is what, as far as I know, is the state of the art. It's the best knowledge and the best understanding we have, and it's certainly the one I find most persuasive. But it is entirely possible that in 20 years, the version that is taught in this course will be something different. For whatever that's worth. Madison was quite clear, back to Madison where we started, that the new Constitution was very far from perfect. It would need improvement and amending. Page bottom of 54, top of 55. New laws, though penned with the greatest technical skill and passed on the fullest and most mature deliberation, are considered as more or less obscure and equivocal until their meaning be liquidated and ascertained by a series of particular discussions and adjudications. Adjudications means courts. We won't know what this thing means in any kind of specific detail until it's interpreted by courts in the adjudication of cases, until there are debates in Congress over particular bills and policies, until we work it out. Others, who were not in the reading, like Benjamin Rush, Edward Carrington, Tench Coxe, all agreed that this was an attempt and that there should be Tench Coxe, let us give it a trial. Carrington, the system yet requires much to make it perfect. I hope experience will be our guide in taking from it or adding to it. Rush, whoever saw anything perfect come from the hands of man. In this initial period, the assumption was, we'll change this as we go. By 1800, that has changed. By 1800, which is also the rise of parties, it's the final split between Jefferson and the Federalists, the creation of the Democratic Republican Party. By 1800, the focus has moved away from the idea, well, if it's not working right, we can rewrite it or rewrite bits of it, and shifted to how do we interpret it? That is, the text is fixed. Yes, Article 5 provides an amendment process. It's extraordinarily difficult. In general, the way to adjust the meaning and application of the Constitution is not to rewrite it every time, but rather to argue about how to interpret it. And of course, this means there's a very, very central role for courts, which are the authorized interpreters of the Constitution in practice, a point we will get back to later. So a couple of debates, for example, that illustrate these points about ways of thinking about just what it is, what the status of the text is, right? Even before you get to what does it mean or what does it require, is this law good, is this law, before you get into just what is it? Is it a draft that we should all take part in rewriting anytime we see something we don't like? Is it a fixed, sort of graven in stone text that we should interpret? And then what is this thing? Because there wasn't really a precedent. There was the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. There was the Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641. There were the state constitutions that had been adopted after 1776. There was no long history of written constitutionalism, and there was no model of a long history to draw on of a single constitutional text subject to the possibility of amendment. The Magna Carta. You know the Magna Carta? Right? 13th century key English document. What you might not know is that almost all the provisions of the Magna Carta were eventually overruled by ordinary statutes passed by Parliament. Almost none of the Magna Carta is still good law. It wasn't treated as a constitution. It's subject to being overruled by Parliament. It's just an act of Parliament. It's a famous act of Parliament. It's often pointed out as the first statute passed by Parliament. Parliament was originally an advisory body to the king. It's not until the 15th century that you start seeing Parliament really passing laws, and it's not until the 17th century that it really becomes the primary legislating force of the country, late 16th, 17th century. At the time of Magna Carta, it's often said that that's the first real written statute Parliament passed, but it was just a statute. Very different enterprise. So like amendments, for example. If we amend this thing going forward, so let's say we adopt an amendment. How do you record that? Do you change the words of the document? Or you add it at the end as an appendix? We do the latter, right? Our amendments are listed separate from the original text, right? You do realize this. That's why they're numbered. Somebody nod. Thank you. I was getting really nervous there for a minute, because if that was a point of mystery, we had big problems. Well, think about it. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. But what about all the provisions in the original text that refer specifically to slavery and protect slavery? Or determine the bounds of slavery? What happens? And it's really interesting. If you buy one of those pocket constitutions on the street, you know, the ones that get handed out all over the place, some versions, the slavery provisions have been removed. Some they're there but crossed out, like with a red line. Some they're just there. You're just supposed to know that those provisions aren't operative because of the 13th Amendment as you're reading through. Why do we do that? Why don't we? Well, because we've abandoned the idea that this is a document we, the people, can rewrite. Right? Amendment is no longer, as it was in the early period, fix something and change it, you know, rewrite it, redraft it, continue this ongoing process of experimentation. No. Now it's taking a thing and adding something to it. And the reason, says Roger Sherman, is because it's impossible. We might as well endeavor to mix brass, iron, and clay as try to incorporate such heterogeneous articles, the one contradictory to the other. You have to list the amendments separately because they're going to be different. They're going to contradict the points of the text, and you can't meld them in. Other countries don't do it that way. If you abolish slavery, why not just go through the Constitution and take out the references to slavery? The removal debate. The very first Congress, 1789, this is the second half of the first meeting of the first Congress, which formed in 1788. Who has the power to remove the Secretary of State, for example? Or who should have the power to remove executive officials in government? This was a fight between Parliament and Charles I in the 1630s. This is not a new fight. Is the cabinet a tool of the legislature to restrict the president, or a tool of the president to carry out his will in contention with the legislature? In the British system of no confidence votes, right, and the winning party creating a government, it's much closer to the case that the government reflects the Parliament, represents the Parliament. The executive branch of government is still from Parliament, answerable to Parliament, chosen by Parliament, and removable by Parliament. There is no strong separation of powers in the British system. In our system, how should that work? Elbridge Gerry says there are two questions, and listen to how he frames the questions on this technical, arcane, I can see your faces, boring question of who gets to fire cabinet secretaries or heads of agencies. Incredibly important, but incredibly hard to get excited about. But listen to how Gerry phrases the issue. The first question is whether the sovereignty of the Union has delegated to the government the power of removal. And the second, to whom? Gerry is assuming there is a single sovereignty of the Union, the people. And he breaks the question down into two questions. Does the Constitution, has the American people as a national sovereign, who distribute powers, this goes to the state, this goes to the national government, this goes to this branch, this goes to this branch, right? You imagine a bunch of people in one big room deciding all this stuff. Has the decision been made that there is removal power at all? Or are all appointments lifetime? Second, if there is a removal power, which branch of government gets it? That two-stage questioning, you're going to see that a lot throughout the semester. Often it takes the form, what is the constitutional rule and how does it apply? Or what is the governing principle and what are its constitutional implications? What's the appropriate test and what's the outcome of applying that test? Keep an eye out for a very, very consistent pattern, modeled here by Gerry, of dividing questions into a two-stage inquiry sometimes more than two, but usually two, which try, and the reason is to try and separate the principle from its application. It's a form of reasoning that bespeaks a degree of formalism. We will ask the question about what is the test, what is the principle, what is the rule, first without any context. We'll reach a formal and abstract answer to that question. Then we will look to the circumstances, the case, the facts, whatever, and apply those things in the appropriate way. All right, we will stop there. Yeah, we'll stop there. Lots more good stuff to come.